This is the RDU on Stage podcast. I'm Lauren Van Hemert, your host, and on this episode, we are talking about the 19th Amendment Project. Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Van Hemert, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me a little bit because I've structured this episode a little bit differently than some of my other episodes. I've divided this episode into 3 parts. Part 1 is an overview and history of the 19th Amendment. Part 2 is an interview with playwright Hannah Benitez, and Part 3 is an interview with Piedmont laureate Tamara Kassane. What ties all these pieces together is the 19th Amendment Project, which is a collection of plays commissioned and co-produced by Burning Coal Theater, the League of Women Voters of Wake County, and 12 other area theater companies. So let's get started. As you may already know, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which ensured that U.S. citizens would not be denied the right to vote on the basis of sex. The fact that this centennial comes against the backdrop of a pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the naming of the first woman of color as the running mate on a presidential ticket feels significant, albeit not quite celebratory. Here's Diana Wynn of the League of Women Voters of Wake County to explain why.
So this is the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, of course, is what recognized that women in this country have the right to vote. And gave the vote to women in all the states. It was an important milestone. Many of the states in the U.S. Did not give women the full franchise, and it was a 72-year-long fight to win the vote. And a lot of people don't realize how long it went on. It is an important milestone in the history of suffrage for women, but I think that it's important to remember that that was not the end of the fight for women's suffrage, that in 1920, the 19th Amendment largely benefited white women. And that was particularly the case in the South, where there were all sorts of Jim Crow laws in place, like literacy tests and poll taxes and outright intimidation at the polls. So the fight for suffrage continued well into the 30s, 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, some important legislation, and the League would argue that it continues today as we continue to fight for voting rights for all. So here we are 100 years later, commemorating this important milestone, but still acknowledging that there's a lot of work to do and that there were a lot of women and men that for the past 100 years continued the fight for suffrage. It's an important year in all sorts of ways to learn about that history.
So can you speak to me about the intersectionality of race and gender and its importance as we approach this upcoming election?
Well, I don't know if it's, from our perspective, if it's about the election per se. We think that, in our advocacy work, we need to understand notions of intersectionality. And when we go back and we look at the history of the fight for women's rights in this country, it is so clear that many, I would say most, of the white women suffragists from the 1800s, the early 1900s, really did not understand the notion of intersectionality. And of course, women of color not only understood it, they lived it. And why is that relevant today? It certainly, we see the vestiges of that even 100 years later in some of the work and organizations, to the extent to which I think people are working and collaborating together. And we can see it play out in our social justice movements, right? I wonder if there had been true collaboration, and if the white women had fully embraced Black women's concerns 100, 150 years ago, if our landscape socially and culturally might have been different today. And people have asked me, well, isn't that that's easy to suggest with a hindsight of 2020, 100 years later, right? And I don't think that it's that unreasonable to suggest. There actually, during the abolitionist movement, Black women and white women worked collaboratively together. There was a falling out early on in the history, and then particularly as the suffrage movement started focusing on the South. They had a Southern strategy, and there was racist rhetoric on both sides of the movement, and many arguing that if you gave women the right to vote, that meant giving Black women also the right to vote, and that would upset white supremacy. And many of the white women suffragists, they did not disavow that. They either embraced racist rhetoric or they tiptoed around it. And those are all things that we need to reconcile 100 years later, because some of that still goes on. It plays out in how we engage with others, right? History impacts us for a long time.
The League of Women Voters of Wake County approached Burning Coal Theater about collaborating on a project to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Originally, the project was going to feature a series of commissioned plays presented live over 2 days, but COVID-19 thwarted Burning Coal's plans. While it did seem feasible to produce 14 10-minute live plays, it seemed a bit overwhelming to single-handedly produce 14 short films. So Burning Coal's artistic director, Jerome Davis, reached out to theater companies from the Triangle to the Sandhills to co-produce this series of videos. Here is Davis talking about the 19th Amendment Project and the importance of the history play genre in filling in the gaps and helping us understand the present.
I don't know what else theater is really than history. Really, it's the stories that we tell about things that have happened, or maybe sometimes things that might happen. The thing about human beings is that we're kind of born into this world alone, and we go out alone, and during most of the time we're here, we don't really know what's going on very much. We don't know how we got here. We don't know what we're supposed to do. We don't know whether we're doing it right. And so to learn about how other people thought and did is important. And I think it's particularly important in the realm of politics, which has such a vast influence on the lives of the citizens of a given country. And so the 19th Amendment is a particularly important story for us as citizens of this country to try to understand as much as we can.
So here's an interesting fun fact. Jerome Davis was the first guest on the Are You On Stage podcast back in January 2019. At that time, I was talking to him about another play he had commissioned for Burning Coal Theater called Ash in Johannesburg. That play was written by Hannah Benitez, a Cuban Jewish American playwright, performer, and musician who has also penned The 19th, one of the plays that will be featured as part of the 19th Amendment Project. She told me her Cuban grandmother taught her how to play the piano at a young age, which ended up being a bit of a springboard for Benitez to pursue a professional career in the arts. And that is where our conversation begins.
My grandmother taught me. She was a piano teacher, and she taught me to play piano at a young age. She was my Cuban grandmother, actually, and that was something she brought with her to the U.S. and what she did for a living when she got here. And so that was a big part of my childhood, which filtered into going to performing arts high school. And basically, since I've been working as a professional, I've been working as a member of Actors Equity and doing a lot of actor musician contracts and things like that. So basically I've been working hard to develop different instrument proficiencies, and so I play a few things, and the accordion is my favorite instrument to play. Recently I did a production of of the show Indecent, and I got to play the accordion in that. And what was really cool is the whole contract was sort of a master class in accordion, because I got to play with Nancy Three, the woman who played accordion for our band, and then Lisa Gutkin, who co-wrote the music for the show. She was in our production, so working as a professional has also like allowed me to hone in on those skills and hopefully get better with each show I do, and that filters its way into my writing as well.
You know, for me, when a play works, it is just rhythmically beautiful in its language. So, does your music background help you in constructing the rhythmic language of a play?
That's a great question. Wow. I would say yes, and my answer is yes, even when sometimes the answer is also no. Often I'll when I'm working on a piece, or when I'm writing a new play, I'll often have like a soundtrack that I'll play, like that I'll develop with it, um, and like start creating to play while I write. And whatever the vibe of that soundtrack is, definitely affects and informs the language and the rhythm of the play. But with that said, also sometimes I've written certain plays that they just don't feel like music, and I will write in silence, and I think it creates something much more different. But it's just what that particular play kind of needs. So I use it sometimes, music, and then I don't.
On your website, it says that all your work is female centered and focused on people of color. Do you feel that there is an immediacy to your work?
Yes.
How so? Do you think when we are looking at history plays like this one, do you think that these shows have the ability to change our collective conscious and how we view history?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would say definitely yes. I think the best example we have of that in pop culture right now, related to theater, is Hamilton. You know, I think that's a perfect example of something that Americans can look to, that is a historical play, and they can absolutely, it's easily accessible, I think, to a lot of people, and I think it totally applies to what you're saying.
So, the two main characters in this play, Alice and Minnie, are on a steam train. Can you give me an overview of what the play is about and the time period that it takes place in?
Absolutely, yeah. So this play is set in 1855, in the southwest of what is now the state of New Mexico, and it follows two women who are on a steam train, who are for some reason stuck in the cabin in the front part of the train, where normally the driver and the everybody who works in there would actually be shoveling coal into the burner and making the train go. And as the plot unfolds, we get an understanding of why these two people, who don't necessarily seem like they should be together, and certainly not together in this part of the train, are why they're trapped in there. Yeah, and I wanted to explore a period of time that took place significantly before, when the 19th Amendment was passed. So that's, how many years is that? Like a solid 70 years or so before. And I picked 1855 because it's a period of time in which we really started to see a big event that led to a huge change in the economy of America, right? The idea of steam trains and the railways. And I wanted to see why women weren't involved in that, and why they missed out economically, and how they were affected by that. So this play deals with, I think, the idea of career, the idea of being able to develop a skill set so that you can become independent, and how gender affects that, and how gender has, if that's changed over time, or how that's changed over time.
Because the suffragette history is so problematic in its roots, did that have any influence on you setting the play 70 years prior to kind of give some context?
Yeah, absolutely. And also something that I wanted to address in the play and it's just touched on in the 10-minute version of my play, because I do intend to expand this into a full-length play, is the fact that Indigenous women in North America weren't even considered citizens. Least of all, certainly they weren't going to get a vote. The men and women of Indigenous population weren't even considered citizens in almost all cases. So I wanted to sort of, rather than start at the 19th Amendment, I wanted to go backwards and see how we arrived at where we were in 1919 when the amendment was put into place, and how it could be that we were only seeing one type of suffragette. I mean, I think we all know why, but I just sort of wanted to go deeper into the foundation as opposed to start at the surface of it.
What do you hope audiences will learn from Alice and Minnie?
I think I want people to develop more empathy for other people that are in a different class situation than they are, be it men or women in a different class. Because what I'm trying to do with this play is really emphasize how people end up where they are. And that's not just about opportunity and privilege, but it really is as simple as, well, what were women at this period of time allowed to even learn? What were they even allowed to learn? So I think what I would like audiences to walk away with is a little bit more empathy for people in different socioeconomic classes than they are. That's my ultimate goal, and that is female focused. But I think if I can achieve audiences to have a little bit more of a zoom out perspective, that would be great too.
I think that one of the things that is so extraordinary about this project for me is that clearly Burning Coal Theater had to pivot and go virtual with it. And in that, they brought in a lot of other theaters to help them. Is this the new way of doing theater in the time of COVID, this type of collaboration?
This project is actually the only one that I know of that is doing things that way. I'm sure there's others out there, but I haven't directly been involved with a project that involves more than one theater company yet. So I don't really know.
Is there a difference in the writing process and writing for something that is going to be done virtually versus something that's going to be done live?
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, actually, when I was approached about the 19th project, that was right before we knew that things were going to go virtual. So when I was initially brainstorming this idea, I wasn't brainstorming it for a virtual medium, but I very quickly adapted my mindset to that. And like I said, the setting, it's a one set play, my play, and it's in the engine room of a steam train. So thankfully, I didn't have to. Adapting the story wasn't as arduous as it could have been for other ideas that I could have allowed myself to have. So thankfully, the timing was just right, and that adapting that to a virtual format wasn't too tricky.
And are you finding in this time of COVID quarantine that we are in, does it nurture your creativity or does it hinder your creativity?
Yeah. Oh my God. It totally nurtures me. I'm in my element. I don't have to go outside ever. This is the greatest excuse I've ever had to not go anywhere. So I am living my fullest hermited writer life and loving every minute.
The 19th, a short play by Hannah Benitez, co-produced by Sweet Tea Shakespeare, is scheduled to premiere August 23rd and run through the end of September. I will put ticket information in the episode notes. Another playwright involved in the 19th Amendment project is our current Piedmont laureate, Tamara Cassane. Cassane took a more contemporary approach to this project and set her play Thunderclap in the future, November 3rd, 2020 to be exact. At the center of her play is a character named Alice who has just turned 18 and is able to vote for the very first time. Kassane recalls her first experience voting, and that is where our conversation begins.
The first time that I remember voting was when I was in elementary school. And Geraldine Ferraro was running as vice president with Walter Mondale. And we had a school wide kind of poll, student poll. I guess they were trying to teach us about politics and all of that. And so all the students got to vote. And then we compared the results in the school to the actual results from the national election. And that is the first time I remember voting. Of course, I voted for Geraldine Ferraro. I didn't really care about Walter Mondale at all. He was unremarkable, but this idea of having a woman as vice president, even when I was in elementary school, was just, it was magnificent. It was so motivating. And I could not for the life of me understand why people were not voting for her. Well, and that's within my school, but also across the country. I was completely gobsmacked that she did not win. And that's when I remember voting for the first time.
That is so cool because I was going to ask you, as a mom, because you have school age children, are they engaged in the political process because they've participated in a type of election or voting in school?
Yes, absolutely. That my older daughter is 12, and that has definitely been part of her elementary and middle school education, getting the kids excited about voting and what that means. And, certainly when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were running against one another, there was a lot of political conversation in our house and at school. And so I feel like my daughter has a really good sense of what is going on politically.
And it's really interesting to me as I'm doing these interviews and I'm chatting with women who do have younger children. It really seems like our younger generation now is engaged in politics in this interesting new way. Do you think that has something to do with social media or maybe television?
I don't know. I think that social media must have something to do with it. And I feel like they are connected to one another in a way that I don't remember being connected to the people of my generation. Now, I'm Gen X, so everything is completely colored by my own sort of disillusioned generation and how I felt growing up. But it seems like the way in which young people today can mobilize and maintain the connections to one another across all of these social media platforms really helps to motivate. I desperately wish that people of my generation and older were so motivated, and were motivated in a way that helps the younger generations, the generations coming up. I don't feel like the Gen Xers and the boomers and even some of the millennials are voting in a way that will help the people who are coming of age now. We're not voting for them and taking care of them. And so I feel like perhaps the people who are coming to voting age now are seeing that they need to take care of themselves. And that is very motivational. It's also really disappointing.
It's funny. I don't remember my first time voting, but my daughter, she will turn 18 in September, and she was able to vote for the first time in the primaries. And she was excited about it, but I think she was also a bit nervous. And so when we walked into the polling place and she gave her name and they looked her up, when they realized she was a first time voter, they all started applauding and cheering for her, which I thought was really endearing, but it actually made her feel really self conscious. So it was interesting experiencing that first through her eyes.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm not sure I would like it if I went to vote like now. If I went to vote and people were like, "Yeah," I'm not sure I would feel comfortable with that either. And I think that it really is about the other people who are saying like, "Yes, we have another voter. Thank goodness." And I think that's part of the pressure that I imagine that these younger people might feel is like it's like everything rests on you. You must vote. You must, save us. So
Yeah, I think she felt a bit of pressure. In the play, I kind of chuckle because your character, Alice, says to her mom, "You did all the right things. You helped me register early. You had me listen to NPR." Are you that type of mom? Are you force feeding your children NPR and podcasts?
Well, my plan is to really step it up. Like my poor sweet child, the closer that we get to voting age, I think the more that I will bring in the experts and really give her a steady diet of my own political viewpoints. So poor thing. However, right now she's just pretty much listening to me and me holding forth on my own personal soapbox and telling her how I feel about things. Because, it's so interesting. Last night, when Kamala Harris was announced as the VP for Biden, which, of course, we're super excited about, she started talking about some Trump ads about Biden and quoting back some of the rhetoric from those ads. And first of all, my husband and I were mortified. We're like, "Oh, you don't believe that, do you?" Like, and then we're starting to counter all of this. But I said, "How did you even come across these?" Like, she doesn't have unlimited access to all the technology and all the TV and all the screen time, but it was just through kind of the regular, what you would expect kids looking for kid-like things on YouTube. And there she saw some of these ads, and they affected her. They seeped into her consciousness, and so it was really interesting. I did not expect to hear that from a 12-year-old, and that makes me think that we're going to need to be really thoughtful about countering that and making sure that she does receive facts and not just sort of the media blah 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 clearly biased information on through the screens.
Well, and I do think a lot of the Trump ads are focused on fear, and to counterbalance that with facts, no matter what side of the party line you're on, I think that's really important for our kids and for us to do as parents.
Right. And I think, for me, the challenge will be to let both of my children make their own decisions, right? Whatever they are, 10 or 15 years from now, as they become like full-fledged adults. And I think that you're right. The important step here is to present the facts and let them make their decisions. And as much as I have very strong feelings about what those decisions should be, they have the right. They have the right to vote their own way. They have the right to be informed and then make a decision based on that. I was looking at quotes when I was writing this play, and the young woman in the play, her name is Alice, and her parents named her after Alice Paul, who was a suffragette. And I found this really good quote by Alice Paul that I think about from time to time. Do you mind if I read it to you?
Oh, please do.
Okay. This is a quote. Here we go. "I think if we get freedom for women, then they're probably going to do a lot of things that I wish they wouldn't do. But it seems to me that isn't our business to say what they should do with it. It is our business to see that they get it." And that was a quote from Alice Paul. And that's something that I struggle with because I have seen so many examples of women who vote against their own interests, and white women in particular, who have a history of electing misogynist autocrats who, who administer it, who work against the public good, right? And so, in some ways, white women have weaponized this vote that was fought for and suffered for. And so that is one of the struggles that I have in being generous and calm when I consider that all people have the right to vote their own way.
You know, it's kind of a struggle for me because, on the one hand, we as women need all the rights we can get because our rights are constantly being challenged and threatened. And yet, on the other hand, when you look at the history of the suffragette movement and how it is so steeped in racism, I don't know, it kind of makes it a mixed bag for me.
Yes, yes. I have very complicated feelings about celebrating this 100th anniversary because, I mean, starting with like, why did it take so long? Why was it such a mess? And how have things not changed at all in the 100 years that, 100 years is a long time, and how much progress have we made? And so I tried to even put examples of misogyny in the short little 10-minute play that I wrote. It's like, this is still a thing. We have so much farther to go. Um, and and so it's very complicated, and the way that we feel about voting and what voting means and what our vote means, it's just very complex. And it's not just about like, rah rah, we're so lucky that women can vote.
So, in this project, there are 14 plays written by female identifying playwrights. And collectively, to me, the work feels very political and feminist. Do you consider your work feminist and or political overall?
Yes. And I say that without reservation. Because I am a feminist and because I am political. And I think that if I wasn't expressing that through my work, that I wouldn't be fully expressing my own voice. I also think that part of my mission is to raise awareness the best way I know how, or at least provoke conversation, right? And so I think that life is too short to dance around we don't have time. We don't have time to dance around these major issues and to pretend that they are not happening. Like, this is the moment when we have to go straight at this and have conversation and be open to that. And I have no problem identifying as a feminist. I have no problem identifying as a what I've now heard is a new term called a politivist, which is a political activist. And I think that people need to embrace that not as something that is divisive, but as potentially something that can unite us and or at least spark conversation.
Do you feel that there is an immediacy when you write, especially a play or a story like this one that feels so timely?
It's interesting because I looked back and the first draft, so this project happened fast, at least from my perspective. The first draft that I wrote, I turned in on March 5th, which was, really at the beginning of things starting to shut down. And we didn't know what the rest of this year was going to look like. So setting a play essentially in the future, because this is supposed to be election 2020, I was kind of guessing what I thought that might look like. And then I redrafted in July when it looked like we were going to be still wearing masks and things were getting worse and worse and worse. And so writing something for almost immediate consumption, as you're talking about, has been a really interesting exercise because things have shifted so rapidly. When I wrote this first draft, I was still hoping that Elizabeth Warren would be our Democratic nominee. And so the way I wrote that it has shifted over the course of this year. But I do feel a sense of urgency around this conversation because I think that when I consider what it means to vote, it implies a certain kind of engagement, right? When we go to the polls, we are actively engaging in this process. And so that engagement needs to be encouraged and supported and validated. And one way to do that is to put these plays out there that talk about the value of voting and make it both an individual experience, but also a communal experience. Again, in this time when we find it really difficult to get together.
So you've written audio dramas, full-length plays, now short plays. Can you talk to me about the challenge of crafting a 10-minute play?
Well, related to this specifically, there's just so much. It's trying to decide how to distill, how to focus on one idea in 10 minutes. Because, I mean, when we talk about the 19th Amendment, the beautiful thing is you could write for a million years about it. The difficult thing is you only have 10 minutes. So what do you include? What do you discard? How do you really narrow your focus in and tell something that has a shape to it and that short amount of time. So that's the challenge. But I also think that in some ways, writing a short piece is so much easier than writing something that has multiple episodes or is a 2-act full length play, just because of the bite-sized nature of it. You can kind of get in, hit it, and get out. You don't have to do a lot of development. You don't have to kind of stretch the action out over time. So it's almost like a surgical strike. You just have to go in, reveal everything, and then get out clean, you know? And so in that way, I actually really like these short pieces. This is the first year that I have written many of them. I think I've written 4 or 5 this year already, because that is the thing that I think theaters are really embracing a lot this year, and audio and Zoom theater. Those 10-minute pieces written by a lot of playwrights is one of the easier things to produce. It's also one of the easier things, at least for me, to turn out, because you don't need an enormous development time like you would for a 2-act play.
There are several other theaters involved in the presentation of this work. What does collaboration look like in the time of COVID? Is this a new way of doing theater?
Well, I think we really have to band together. And I think that pre-COVID life, everything was moving so quickly. And I saw a lot of siloing and people essentially recreating the wheel on their own, because everyone was moving at such speed that we weren't taking the time to share resources or share information about process, or work across. I think there was an idea of the scarcity of audiences that kind of got in the way of people working together. But the way the financial situation right now is so dire for theater companies and for freelance artists, that there needs to be a new way of operating. And I think that turning to one another is the way that we might all get through. I think also seeing people on Zoom recently, just seeing their faces on Zoom, has meant so much to me, and has really underlined how lonely I am for my theater community and how much those relationships mean. And so I also think this has been a wonderful reminder about how special we are as a theater community, not just my individual institution or not just the 4 people in my play, but as a theater community, how beautiful we all are. And the work that we are creating is beautiful across the community here, across the country. And it's just been a really affirming experience, and an urge to kind of strengthen these networks that feel so tenuous right now when we can't come together as audience members or as makers in the way we did before.
I agree. And to be honest with you, there was so much excitement around Hamilton being shown on Disney Plus. It's funny, my son and I, we had seen Hamilton on Broadway. And so he was so excited to watch it on television, and we set up kind of a viewing party. And watching it made me actually really miss and mourn the live experience even more. And so I had trouble sitting through it.
Yeah. It is not the same. It is not the same at all. And I think that this has also been a reminder of what we cherish about live performance. And so there are, I think everybody is investigating these other mediums as a way of kind of getting through and figuring out how to refine them and make them as kind of robust and meaningful as possible. But it is not the same as being in a room together and experiencing theater in a lot of ways. I mean, you can't do the same things on Zoom as you can in a live theater or an audio. And so it's special in that way. And I think it has been a nice reminder for me of that specialness and how excited I will be to get back to it, instead of having that feeling sometimes where it's like, oh, theater again. I don't want to, I don't want to do it so hard. And and no one appreciates it. Like all the moaning and groaning that, it happened in 2019 in 2020, it feels ridiculous, So
I interviewed Jerome Davis, the artistic director of Burning Coal, and I asked him about virtual experiences, and he referred to them as placeholders. So, from the artist perspective, do you think these virtual productions and live streams will hurt or help live theater in the long run?
that's an excellent question. I mean, I think that it depends on if we're talking about financially or creatively, because I think that the one of the challenges with live theater, right, are the tickets and getting people to show up when they could stay at home and watch Netflix or watch, whatever on their computers. And I think people are becoming even more entrenched in that because that's the only option. Right. And so, how do we get people to pay for live theater on the other side of this is a question about helping or hurting. And I don't know the answer to that. I'm hoping that people will be so overjoyed that they can go out and experience this, that they will run to the theater in droves. So that's an open question for me. I think that there are opportunities to cultivate new audiences during this time because that theater companies are turning to more online options that people who did not think theater was for them might be pleasantly surprised and encouraged and engaged. It sort of swings back around to this idea that we're talking about with voting. Voting is about engagement. And so how do we get people engaged enough that they will show up? And I think theater companies have that question as well, and playwrights and makers. How do we get people engaged enough in this idea, in this medium, that when they have the opportunity, they will show up? And perhaps engaging them now online is a way to do that. I also think that in my perfect world, I'm super interested in interdisciplinary options for live theater. So perfecting some of this virtual stuff might be it might be interesting to kind of braid that together with live theater when we have that option as well. And so I don't know, these are all really good questions. Right now I'm just focusing really hard on writing content so that when the gates open, we can start coming together and making things. Right now it's just about doing all that preparatory work, the sort of behind the scenes development work, so that when we have the option, we can take that.
Do you think that this period of time will mark some sort of cultural shift in the types of stories we're going to see on stage and the people writing or telling those stories?
Absolutely. I feel like, taking us back to the beginning of the conversation and talking about the necessity of slowing down. In this case, it is a forced slowdown for many people. My hope is that slowdown has also ramped up accountability around representation, around the stories that are being told and who is telling those stories. That is what I've seen, that there has been a sort of a wider push for accountability measures and for change that is not just spoken about but is actually implemented. And I think that if we see change that is implemented, then yes, this will mark an important shift in who is telling the stories, what stories they are, and what do they focus on moving forward. That is my great hope.
So, not only are we commemorating the 19th Amendment, but we are also in the midst of the fourth wave of the women's movement, coupled with an uprising in the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you think that these plays read differently now than they might in a typical election year?
I hope so. I feel like as audience members, we bring our understanding of our world into the theater. And so the lenses that I wear as an audience member are the lenses, of my world, right? And so as the world changes, the way that I am interpreting what I see changes. when I think about the things that I was taught as an elementary school child about things like Christopher Columbus and Mount Rushmore and all of the information that I was fed as that child colored the way that I understood the world. Now I have more information. And now that changes how I understand the world. And that extends to the art that I see as well. And that's reflected by me as an artist. Part of my job as a playwright is interpreting the world, is asking questions of the audience members. And that is informed by 2020, when there has suddenly become a public awareness of Black Lives Matter and systemic racism. It's always been there, but it's now sort of covering the lenses through which I see the world. And I feel it is the same way with this election that is vitally important to our country moving forward. That is, of course, going to color the lenses through which I see everything and interpret everything, both as an artist and an audience member. So I hope it affects people and is based in our current reality.
Tamara Kassane's play Thunderclap is being presented by William Peace University and will be released August 27th. I have to be honest with you, it has been very hard for me to get excited about virtual theater productions. However, there is something that feels so fresh and immediate about the 19th Amendment Project to me that it really has fueled my insatiable appetite for theater and what this medium that I love so much can do to educate, inspire, and affect change. I will be releasing 9 more interviews with the playwrights behind these productions, so be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single one. If you like what you've heard today, please consider becoming a patron of this podcast. Follow us on social media at RDUOnStage or visit us online at www.rduonstage.com. Until next time, I'll see you at the theater.